A good contract is worth its weight in gold. Are you a creative entrepreneur who contracts your services to others? Well, listen up, because this is for you. The Smithers Law Group has created 14 master contracts specifically for creative entrepreneurs. These contracts are industry specific, they're fully customizable, and you only pay a one-time fee. This is so much better and more affordable than speaking with an attorney who's going to charge you an hourly consultation fee, and it's so much more secure than just Googling up your contract and hoping for the best. Find your fully customizable and industry-specific contract at stulawgroup.com. Search for the contract link. And don't forget to tell them that I sent you.
We look at U.S. history, we have the Great Migration, which, millions of Black Americans, particularly from the South, were moving to the North, to places like New York, to the Midwest, and even, further out west, like California, throughout the 1910s, roughly, to like the 1970s. And a similar track was also happening for people from Africa, from the continent of Africa, from the Caribbean as well, moving for, greater opportunities, moving for school, even, coming to whether it's the US or sometimes UK, etc., to go to school. And I think really understanding that there's a common experience of oppression as Black people, whether, no matter where you are, right?
Welcome to Impostrix Podcast, the space where we talk about the complexities of imposter syndrome narratives as experienced by people of color, and where we talk about navigating the landscape of racial toxicity in our careers. I'm Whitney Knox-Lee. I'm a consultant, an attorney, a mediator, and I'm your host. I'm here on this journey with you toward validation, rootedness, and liberation. Join me and our guests as we share relatable experiences, explore impactful tips and tools, and talk about the complexities of the pursuit of career success as people of color. Here we're becoming rooted in our power together. We're setting aside imposter syndrome, interrupting racial toxicity and racism, and redefining what it means to thrive in our careers. Here, we're being validated. So let's go. Welcome back to Impostrix Podcast. My name is Whitney Knox-Lee. I am the host of Impostrix Podcast. I'm talking today with Alexandria Miller, and we are going to be talking all about Caribbean American history and what Caribbean migrants brought to the United States, both in terms of the civil rights movement, but also in terms of our identities and the cultural melting pot that we have, not just more broadly within the U.S., but within Black communities. And so I'm really excited to have Alexandria with us. Alexandria, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Whitney. It's such a pleasure to be on your show. And as a fellow podcaster myself, it's always fun to be sometimes on the other side and maybe not having to edit and do some of those things. So I don't envy you for having to go edit this show after me, but very much so understand what it looks like. I am a Jamaican American, first generation born in the U.S. I am a doctoral student. I study Caribbean history, so that's one of the reasons I'm on the show today. And I also have my own podcast, Strictly Facts, A Guide to Caribbean History and Culture, which really, at this point, feels like another baby. I don't have a baby, so one of my, fictitious babies in a sense, but was really born out of not only my love for Caribbean history, my work as a scholar and teacher, but also just as a way for me to share knowledge with other communities who are either, within the Caribbean diaspora wanting to learn more about the region, and the diaspora as well, or just those who are merely interested about wanting to know a little bit about Caribbean history. I certainly recognize that I've been able to learn a lot of things, being able to get into and, explore higher education at the institutions that I have. And so it's just one of my ways of giving back and wanting to share that knowledge and all that I've learned with others who, may not be their route or, just the standards and metrics of higher education as well.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me because I know very little about Caribbean history. I frankly was just noticing how you say the word is not how I was saying the word.
It's different depending on who you ask, actually. So, even
Okay.
within the region, different islands will say it differently. So that one is one of those sort of not necessarily contentious points, but we all have our own individual forms of English. If you're from the English,
Yeah.
speaking Caribbean, and have had many other colonial influences which have impacted our languages, right? And so, for those who may not be aware, places like Jamaica. Jamaica was actually originally a Spanish colony, and then later
Oh.
becomes a British colony, right? There were places that were French, were colonized by the French, and then the Spanish, and then the British. And there's a mix depending on, where we're talking about. And so I think all of those things have really blended into our languages, and determining how we say certain things, even though, for lack of a better way of framing, we're all speaking English to an extent if we're, not everywhere, but some of the islands, of course.
Yeah, well, actually, that was gonna be my next question just about the language. I mean, I know you speak English, but, like
Some people will call it a patois,
okay.
is what it is referred to sometimes in Jamaica. Our national language, in terms of, what the Jamaican government calls it, is English. There are some sort of like those in the linguist community that don't like the term patois because it sort of has origins with kind of creating hierarchies between, what is quote unquote standard English versus what others might be speaking, which is the more creolized version.
Hmm.
It still is commonly referred to as patois, but I do think, depending on who you're talking to, there also have been like activists and scholars. One of the most renowned ones being Miss Lou, who we affectionately call her, Louise Bennett Coverly, who, was really one of the early activists in terms of us wanting to take pride in our national language.
Yeah.
Having been a formerly British colony, and all the things that come with that, the hierarchies, and the ways of demeaning people of color, Black people, and all the things that we do. It was very much so looked towards as, you're like lesser educated, or, how whatever may have
Mm.
you for using patois. Whereas, those like Miss Lou and several others, since her and even before her, especially, have really worked to sort of change that mindset, regarding how we value patois, and, really seeing it as something that's beautiful, that's creative, that actually like highlights our ingenuity in being able to, combine all of the different, not only like linguistic patterns from other places, but, really just as a way for us to have created something that's uniquely ours,
Yeah.
and that shouldn't, stand in its own right beautifully, as opposed to being compared to whatever the British or, whoever are saying.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so as I know I've told you, I've told the listeners that my growth throughout this past year of Impostrix podcast and speaking to people of all different backgrounds has been very eye opening for me as a Black American who really just went around identifying other brown skinned people as Black. Like I was the same as the white people, as you got brown skin, you Black. But as I have had so many conversations with um, brown skinned people from other parts of the country or who have different heritage than I do, I've been learning more about not only what Black Americanism means to me and Blackness as a culture, but also what other people's nationality and or ethnicity or race, how complex it is and how intersectional or how I guess the intersecting identities really come together to create these small pockets of culture within individual families, within individual regions. And so I love to learn from you more about your identity as a Jamaican American woman. Um, because I know, as you said, you're studying Caribbean history and doing your PhD studies on the region. And I'm really curious to hear about like how you became. Well, let me back up. Let me start with, what does your identity mean to you? What does it mean to be a Jamaican American?
Well, I mean, before, I think I'm maybe not before, but I definitely will say I'm a Black Jamaican American.
Mm,
Jamaica, like other places, equally as so in the US too, right? We have people of mixed ancestry. We have, as I said earlier, talking about languages, right? There are many people who have, migrated over different centuries to Jamaica. And so I very much so identify as a Black Jamaican American proudly at that. That identity for me, I think, is everything. It has,
mm,
at times been what I had to contend with, understanding that my blackness may not always be empowered in all spaces. But one thing that I think has definitely been a cohesive point throughout all of my, academic career and even just, personally, is that I've always been able to find people who support me. And those are not always, people from the Caribbean or of Caribbean descent. They have been Black people at large, whether they're from the US, from the continent, from the Caribbean, etc. But I
mhm,
think my Blackness for me is beauty, it's strength, it's the reason
mm,
that I can, wear my hair in locks and it stays this way, and, or the way that I can put on a pink lipstick and feel very empowered in my beauty. And so all of these things I think make up who I am. And, at this stage, right, it's something that I love about myself. So that's a bit about, my identity and how I think it
yeah.
has reflected in my work.
Was that a journey for you? You said, at this stage, this is something that I love about
Oh, I
myself.
mean, for sure, I didn't always have locks. I think my hair journey particularly is one that has definitely been interesting. I think, as a lot of particularly Black women will say, right? Are we relaxing? Are we doing braids? What is the goal, or what are we trying to do there? But I think my hair for me um is something that I'm especially proud of, right? That, it
Mm,
it is this way, right? It was made this way, and I am so proud to wear it in a form that, is beautiful for me. And that's not necessarily as a shade or, in contention to anybody else's personal decisions. I think it's just been for me recognizing that my hair, whether it, was in a relaxer or whether it was, press and comb all those days, right? There always felt like it was a chore almost, right? And I'm not a hair girly, right? There are people I know, I got the friends who can cornrow and do all the things. That's not necessarily my talent. But I've really found strength and growth in the fact that this is my hair and I like what it looks like now.
yeah. So I had locks for 20 years, and I had two sets of locks for like 10 years each. And 10 years seems to be the point at which my hair can't take it anymore. Um, and I don't like how I said that, because it's not that locks were hard on my hair. It's that for whatever reason, cyclically, at about 10 years, my stress got to my hair. And so my hair would start to fall out, locks would start to break off or thinning or whatever the case may be. And so I last cut my locks 2.5 years ago and felt such a sense of freedom, because in our hair, for myself, in my hair, I carried a lot of stress. Um, and during times of transition, you can see it in my hair. And so, that being said, my son the other day told me, "Mommy, I want your hair back in those I want it back long." I was showing him a picture. I was like, "In locks?" And he was like, "Yeah, I want it back long. I like how you look long with long hair." I'm like, "Okay, well, that takes years of dedication and commitment." And like, for me, it wasn't this like free lifestyle type of situation. It was very much, my locks were intentional, every last one of them. Um, and that takes more energy than I thought when I was a young whippersnapper and wanted to get locks. Like, I thought, let me get locks so that I never have to comb my hair again. Which I guess, but also there's so many other things. So, anyways, bringing us back. Um, so how did you decide on your program of study as far as studying Caribbean history? Hey, y'all. So let's switch gears for just a minute. We talk so much about empowerment of folks of color on this show. And now I want to take a second to talk about our legacy. It's so important that as we're out here doing our thing and making that money and trying to be the people that we want to be for our communities and families, that we get our estate plan together. And I know estate planning can be overwhelming. We've got your back. Our team is here to guide you every step of the way. Wills for the People is an estate planning practice that prioritizes creating and advancing generational wealth, particularly within families of color and middle-class families. This is because it's so important that we just get started. So, what do you want your legacy to be? And what steps have you taken to ensure that that happens? Take those steps with Wills for the People, where intentional planning meets transformative results. Visit our website for your free consultation at willsforthepeoplega.com. Mention Impostrix Podcast and we'll give you 10% off of your package. All right, I'll see you over there. Let's get back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, I went to undergrad and pretty much studied Black history from across the diaspora. Did couple study abroad programs and was able to look at the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, civil rights at large across the U.S., and even did like a tour throughout the major civil rights sites in the South, which I thought was great. And being able to study, as I said, and make certain connections that, was really never before made to me. I think one of the shortcomings of education, and I'm talking, particularly pre-college now, right, is that, every Black history is in like a very tight bow, right? Rosa Parks was tired, which we know was wrong now, right? But, at least that's what I was told. She was tired and that's why she didn't get up. And then, Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Then we got the civil rights, legislation, and all was good from there, which, very much so was not the case. It was much more, convoluted than that, or, that's very much so a condensed version that doesn't even really highlight the trials and tribulations, that was the civil rights movement, and even precursors, etc. I remember like reading one line about Marcus Garvey in my history textbook in high school, and it was like Marcus Garvey, Jamaican born, something, something, something. And like that was kind of it. And then the book went on to whatever else it was talking about. And so I think being able to get sort of like corrective or more enhanced versions of this history in college, and being able to pinpoint the parallels between and amongst and the ways that I learned we all worked together in various ways or had very similar struggles really motivated me to want to pursue this degree, and also add to the sort of genealogy of academia, which is forever evolving, right? There are things that, scholars from, say, 50 years ago maybe didn't have access to, right? That we have access to now, and things to that nature. So, and also really wanting to teach and be the change, right? I think, thinking back to some of my higher, or not higher learning, but again, pre-college, mostly like secondary experiences. I was like, I don't know why we only are learning about Black people in February, right? And so wanting to really understand and change the landscape of education and ensure that not only us, right, we definitely deserve to be empowered, but also Black history is a part of American history, shouldn't be limited to 1 month out of the year at all. And so everybody should be aware of all of the various things that have happened.
So I didn't think about this when we talked earlier, but now as you're talking more about your studies and more about the why and the academia of it and the professorship of it, I'm wondering about whether you've had any backlash, whether you've been swooped up in the critical race theory conversation or in the don't teach my children about actual history kind of movement?
I mean, I think because I'm still at a student level, right? Those conversations are definitely happening around me, and um have definitely involved professors who I look up to and admire, etc. But I think because I haven't necessarily finished my
Mm-hmm.
doctoral studies yet, right? I'm still a student, not a professor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I haven't necessarily had to like negotiate those politics. But the classes that I have taught that, have not solely been all Black students, or I've had very good experiences where students who are not Black, not people of color, have walked away with being like, wow, I had no idea that this has happened. And I also think to give some of the Gen Zers and whatever they are now their credit, there also is a greater awareness, I think, and a
Mm.
desire to potentially learn than maybe I could say for possibly previous generations. I've also had classes where students are like, yeah, Miss Miller, I know so and so, I know this I've heard of this activist before, or whatever, which I think is, sometimes counter to even some people, in my generation.
Yeah, I mean, as millennials, I consider us as people who grew up with internet and with, access to research and stuff, but nothing like Gen Z, where, I mean, so I think that's an interesting observation around like they're interested in learning and they're coming to class knowing about things that aren't being taught in school. And I imagine that's simply because of the access, but maybe it's not so simple. I don't know, but it is an interesting observation. Um, so I'd love to hear about the impact that Caribbean migrants have had on the civil rights movement here in the United States, because you mentioned Marcus Garvey. I did some Googling, as I was preparing for this conversation, and learned that so many people are either first generation migrants or migrants themselves and had no idea. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
For sure. I mean, I definitely want to start with the fact that while many of us think of the civil rights movement in the, 50s, 60s time period, when we think of things like migration, that's a thing that Black people have always been doing, right? Whether forcibly, obviously through slavery and things to that nature, but also if we look at US history, we have the Great Migration, which, millions of Black Americans, particularly from the South, were moving to the North, to places like New York, to the Midwest, and even, further out west, like California, throughout the 1910s, roughly to like the 1970s. And a similar track was also happening for people from Africa, from the continent of Africa, from the Caribbean as well, moving for, greater opportunities, moving for school, even, coming to whether it's the US or sometimes UK, etc., to go to school. And I think really understanding that there's a common experience of oppression as Black people, whether, no matter where you are, right? And so if we're taking this time period, that 20th century time period, and looking at what is also happening in other places, Jamaica, for instance, gets independence in 1962, right? So you can imagine there were decades of activism happening before that for independence throughout not just Jamaica, but other parts of the formerly British Caribbean. Same thing for the continent of Africa. Many, especially on like the western side of Africa, starts to get independence around the same, 1950s, 1960s time period. So you have Black people across the world really at this time looking for and, being protesting for methods of Black sovereignty, of independence, for human rights, really. And when we all sort of, meet up, it's like, you experience this, I experience this too. It may have been, nuanced in its own little ways, or what have you, but there, were, and, even still to this day, several commonalities between the two. And I think because of that, that's why when we're looking, at the civil rights movement, to name some people who were definitely vested in the movement, who were either born in the Caribbean or of Caribbean heritage. I think of people like Harry Belafonte, which people obviously might know more so for being a calypso singer and for his acting, etc., but was a very big proponent of the civil rights movement. I believe even helped bail out Dr. King during the Birmingham, his Birmingham arrest, in '63. People like Stokely Carmichael, Stokely Carmichael turned Kwame Ture, who was born in Trinidad, migrates to the U.S. as a child, and then, really becomes one of those leading student activists at a time where organizations like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were doing massive things in the South, particularly for the civil rights movement. And then he even, goes on to be the one that coins the term Black Power and was really a leading inspiration for the Black Panther Party. I could go on. We could go like, Young Lords, who is a Puerto Rican organization, really throughout the 60s and early 70s, campaigning for Black and, mostly minorities or, marginalized communities' rights, not just in the US, but also throughout the world. They were also, like anti the war, the Vietnam War at the time. Um,
I mean, Shirley Chisholm.
Shirley Chisholm, right? Born to Barbados and or Bajan and Guyanese parents, and also like lived in Barbados briefly as a child. And goes on to, as many know, become one of the I believe the first Black representative, first Black woman representative. Did some major things in government in terms of like getting domestic workers care for unemployment, securing a lot of rights for students
Wow.
who were marginalized, right? Also then, becomes one of the first woman on the Democratic Party ticket, for president and things to that nature. There's also I haven't seen it yet because it's not out, but Netflix is doing something on her that I know is coming out soon. So I'm really excited to see that when it's out. Malcolm X, who I know everybody is largely aware of, but his mom was from Grenada. Um,
Oh,
yeah, and then
wow.
both of his parents, his father is born in Georgia, but both of his parents were really staunch Garveyites. So back to Marcus
I see.
Garvey
Yeah.
again. And cannot talk about Garvey without really mentioning the fact that the UNIA, United Negro Improvement Association, which he founded, was just like a massive, influence for so many, not only at this time, but for periods to come, with his discussion of Black nationalism, of Pan-Africanism, really as ways of organizing Black freedom, not, independent of one place or another, but really as a collective. So many others. I think, one of my favorites is Claudia Jones, who I think is more renowned possibly in like the UK circles, because she helped found the Notting Hill Carnival in England, and also was the founder of the first Black newspaper there. But prior to her move to the UK, she was born in Trinidad. And then migrates with her family as a child to the US, and was really like one of the leading women in the Communist Party in the US, so much so that, she was really motivating the organization to consider how not just class, but, race and gender struggles were also really pertinent to, considering the party's politics. And she wrote an amazing article at the time, I think in like the late 40s, entitled An End to the Negro, or An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, really just to highlight
Wow.
the impact that race, gender, and class have on Black women, particularly. Yeah, I said that right. Okay.
Wow.
um,
Yeah. Like pre Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality.
yeah, right. So
Wow.
yeah, she doesn't say Crenshaw, or she doesn't say intersectionality specifically, but many people, when they're analyzing this genealogy of the term and how it comes to be, also point to Jones's work as well.
Wow. It's so rich. I mean, and I, I love, I'm really grateful for this conversation because it really, very ignorantly so. For me, the Caribbean is like vacation, you know, like, and I know that there's lots of culture, and I know that there was lots of immigration here, but I have not had any idea on how US culture, how American culture, how Black American culture has been influenced. And even, I mean, talking about culture, Rihanna, like, who in
Hip
her
hop,
own right
even.
is right. Like, and the ways that our society and our and pop culture and women as businesswomen and women as multi hyphenates and all of these things that we've been seeing over the past 20, 30 years, tracing them back to the Caribbean is really interesting. It's really rich in terms of what folks are bringing, and how they're sharing their legacy of activism, and bringing that here.
Definitely, I'd agree. And I mean, I think in a large sense, it's a both and for me, right? Like there are ways that, you know, cultures are different naturally, right? In the South, you might eat collard greens, right? We have kalaloo. It's ultimately like the same. It's a green, on both sides. They're just kind of like cousins in the greens family, however you want to frame that. But I think very similarly, we've all, again, back to my earlier point, have had similar experiences and have been able to learn from and amongst one another in trying to create a better world for all of us, right? That's not to say that there haven't been challenges and differences on either side, but I do think when people look at us, right, they're just like, oh, this is a Black person.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily understanding the deeper cultural or national heritage ramifications of that, and because of that, we've banded together for the better historically.
Yeah. Yeah. So, can you tell me about your own family's history in Jamaica? And how, I mean, do you know your ancestry and how you all wound up in Jamaica?
I mean, not. I mean, I think that is a thing that might be like a more contentious point that people may not
Mm,
have necessarily be aware of, right? A lot of I've definitely seen scholars like do the work of being able to trace their ancestors back to the 1800s. There, the name of this book right now is escaping me, but I'll send it to you later, to add for if anybody wants to check out. But a lot of the documents of who this enslaved who were brought over and stuff are still sort of like housed in the UK, right? And
mm,
so unless you are, and it's not digitized where like you could be in Jamaica or wherever and Google it, right?
mm-hmm,
um and so in a large way, like I can trace mine so far back as to my mom knowing her grandma and whatever
mm-hmm.
stories were told. But to say like, oh, I have I can tell you who my great 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 how many ever times back, is not the case necessarily for me, at least. But my family on both sides were from rural parts of Jamaica, and then my parents ended up migrating for college, or my mom migrated as a child with her family, and then on the other side, my dad's side, migrated for college, and they met in college, and there's me now. But to
Mm-hmm.
say I can tell you which ancestor came over in
Yeah.
17 whatever, yeah.
So when your parents came to the United States, did they go to the South or did they go up north?
No, they went to the north, yeah.
Okay, okay. Because you had mentioned the Great Migration, and I'm a granddaughter of the Great Migration. My both sides of my family, one's from my father's side's from Virginia, and my mother's side from Mississippi, and specifically my mother's side, both of her parents grew up in this small town, and outside of this town was the railroad and the train that took them from Clarksdale, Mississippi to Chicago. And they were among the migration north. And similarly to you, I think on my side of the family, from what we can tell, from what I can tell, we can trace back a couple of generations, but not much further. Like possibly the first generation of freedom, I guess, but not much further than that. So it's it is interesting, and I think it's a misconception that I have of people in other places, outside of the United States, that y'all know where you from, um, because you know we don't, and so it's interesting to hear about some of the additional complexity as that are because of colonization.
Right. And even to that point, I mean, I have great aunts and uncles who, were born in the early 20th century, and due to, still being a colony at the time and how some of those things function, even some of them like lost their I had one great aunt in particular who I can remember there was always like a sort of joke about her birthday because they lost the birth papers or however you want, birth certificate, etc. And so, she's somebody who born in probably it was a guess when she was born, and they kind of just were like, okay, we're going to make up a date for you. And that's something, that happened in the 20th century, which we wouldn't necessarily think of. But yeah, I definitely do get that point and have had that conversation with several other people who have been like, oh, Alex, don't you necessarily like feel a pride knowing, where your ancestors came from? And, I do understand the differences, right? It's not a one to one, and I'm not trying to compare.
Yeah.
But, I also, without maybe like doing a genetic ancestry test, can't tell which part of Africa my ancestors came from either.
So we've talked a little bit about how Caribbean immigrants worked with immigrants from all over, Black immigrants and Black Americans, to bring about the civil rights movement and advances in the labor movement and that type of thing. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how maybe your specific community, your family, or the community that you have now, like how you guys find community and a sense of belonging as um, first generation, or as people who are immigrating directly from the islands to the United States. Because I imagine, I mean, we talked about some of the language differences. We talked about, this is the Black American culture is a different culture. Being in America and being lumped in as Black when maybe you don't identify as Black is, I can only imagine, a rude awakening. So, yeah, I wonder how you all find belonging.
I mean, I think it's different for different people. Maybe it's because I've been born here, or
Yeah.
just due to my parents' own feelings about who they are. I was very always consciously Black,
Okay.
and
Hmm.
okay with, and so I feel like my community is kind of like a smorgasbord of people, right? It is people from the region, it's people who have recently migrated or are, you know, descendants of people who have migrated. It's also Black Americans. It's also people from the continent of Africa. I think, again, it's, the world is changing. It is what it is, right? But I do think I've been able to cultivate a community personally that is aware of all of our differences, but also like in a beautiful sense, and also the
Hmm.
ways that we are similar, and, looking to support one another in our engagements and how we, involve and even share and teach one another the differences, right? Having family who, more recently migrated and don't necessarily know the same history of the civil rights movement, right? That I would, having been educated here, and being able to share with them why there are these certain systemic barriers, or, whatever, what may have you. And so I think for me, it's just been one of teaching, being willing to, share and teach and also learn alongside others, and in a beautiful sense, allowing culture to do that too, right? Because there are a lot of
Mm.
ways that, food and music, right? I think of those two particularly, have brought me and my friends and others together, right? And being like, oh, that kind of tastes like, or, we
Mm.
have a version of this that we make. And Even, if we think of like Afro beats right now, Burna Boy just not last December, December before that, had a giant concert in Jamaica, as well as in Trinidad and a few other islands. And that was a big moment because it was one of, I think, the first time a major artist from Africa performed in the US, or in the Caribbean rather. And
Oh.
so there, and he has songs with Popcorn, who is a major Jamaican dancehall artist, and what may have you. So there are a lot of ways that we work together and do beautiful things that may not always come to the fore in the same way. But I think that's one thing about Black people. I think regardless of where we come from, we are always gonna do something beautiful with what we have. In the Caribbean, in Jamaica, we'd say we turn wahana and make fashion, right? So you find a way to make do with what you can.
Mm.
And we've always, I think, across the board have done something beautiful with that.
It reminds me of this acknowledgement of my liberation is dependent upon your liberation and vice versa. And finding ways to make each other a part of our journey of our collective, battle for liberation so that we are all liberated. And that's really what I hear when I think about these people, coming to the U.S. and then making the civil rights movement their home, and not that they came here to do that, but, kind of falling into that activism and falling into the blackness that was perceived on them, by everyone else, whether or not, they were people who considered themselves Black or not. Um, so yeah, that's really interesting. So I would love to ask you, one of the things that I like to ask my guests before they leave is about their own mantras or affirmations for the season. And I know because you shared with me that you do vision boards every year, that you probably got something. You probably got something
Several.
up your
I have
sleeve.
several, but I think particular to this season and the fact that I'm at that like deadline where I'm just pushing towards graduation, and I can see I can see it in the fore, and just really wanting to be finished with school and make the next strides in my journey, but also remembering that nobody finishes school in 5 seconds, right? And so one mantra that I'm really living by in this season that we say back home in Jamaica is one cocoa full basket, or and more or less it means taking things at a step at a time. You will fill the basket
Mm,
eventually, right? You will reach the accomplishment when it happens, but it doesn't happen overnight. And so just being okay and reminding myself that it's a step by step, day by day I'm writing this dissertation and
mm-hmm.
and doing all the things, but I will get there. So that is my mantra for this season.
That's awesome. I also, so I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, but one of the episodes that I've listened to on your podcast is about like the folklore in the Caribbean, and I wonder if you might share like what is your favorite, because as I understand it, the region has like a strong culture of folklore. And I would love to hear like what's your favorite myth? Or I don't even know if that's the right word for it. Probably
No,
not.
myth works or
Okay.
legend, yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot, and the interesting is there are some very similar ones across the region that are just called different names based off what island or nation you're from, etc. But I always grew up with listening to stories of Anansi the spider, and thinking of him as like this very genius trickster, right? There's always a clever way that he was able to trick people into things or figure something out, right? But always, walking away with a major lesson at the end.
Oh man, so he loses.
Yeah. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes.
Oh. Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for joining us on Impostrix podcast. I really wanted this season to have a lot of history lessons for us because I think that it's important for us to know how we came to be, like how this moment in time came to be. And there are so many pieces to a never-ending puzzle, and history are those puzzle pieces. And so it's it's really helpful for me to have this context as I move forward in my studies, both on race and racial toxicity and what that looks like, and culture, but also in the civil rights movement and how we are building off of that now. So I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, duh. Before we go, please tell us where we can find you and about your
Yes.
podcast.
Yes. So Strictly Facts. There is a new episode every other Wednesday. I'm bi-weekly. We're on all the podcast platforms. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everywhere, iHeartRadio, all the things. And then we are on Twitter at Strictly Facts PD, and Instagram and Facebook at Strictly Facts Pod. So if you find me there, and go to our link tree, it'll link you to wherever you'd like to watch the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I can't believe we almost forgot that. No, people got to listen to this podcast because it's so fascinating. Whether you are somebody, I've got a lot of friends right now. I've made a lot of friends from the Caribbean. So, like, I know they'll be interested. But everybody else, like, it's so fascinating. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh man, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Wasn't it great? I always get so much from the conversations that I have with my guests. If you want to continue listening to Impostrix podcast, there's like 20-something episodes that you can go back and listen to. Also, feel free to join us in the community space on Facebook. You can just search for Impostrix Podcast Validating Space, and you should be able to find it. We welcome all, and it's a space for us to validate each other and engage with each other one-on-one, or well, in a group setting. You can find out all the information about me and Impostrix Podcast at www.impostrixpodcast.com. Until next time, be validated. Hey friends, thank you for listening to this episode. I wanted to take a quick moment to offer some transparency around the creation of this episode and the subsequent promotion of the episode. So I had recorded the episode. Afterwards, I created some social media assets for promotion and posted them all over the place. And immediately, thank God, a friend of mine who is from the Caribbean reached out to me and was like, "Hey, Whitney, like we don't use this word that you're using to describe people from the Caribbean." And I was, of course, horrified, embarrassed, immediately pulled everything down and started engaging with that friend and a couple of other friends about the language that I had used. And so I bring this up because I think, it's important for me as someone who is trying to be a good person, to like, be transparent when the situation calls for that. And in this case, as aware as I consider myself, as culturally competent as I consider myself, the fact of the matter is this was one of the first conversations that I have had with somebody about the Caribbean and the Caribbean heritage and people from the Caribbean and what people from the Caribbean brought to the United States as far as their influence. And so I am not at all culturally competent when speaking about people from the Caribbean. And so I'm really grateful to that friend and to Alexandria, who had conversation with me after I reached back out to her about this concern that was raised by a friend. So essentially the language that I was using, just so that people know, is calling people from the Caribbean Caribbeans. And my understanding is that similar to calling Black people the blacks or blacks, which as a black person, I don't love. Like, that rubs me the wrong way. I can't really put my finger on it, but I don't love it. And also the reality that the Caribbean part of the world is a collection of small islands. There is only one Caribbean. There's not multiple Caribbeans. And so, as I understand it, some people from the Caribbean prefer to be called people from the Caribbean, or West Indian, people from the West Indies, or, Jamaican or Haitian, or whatever the country that they're from. I don't know what the word is when you say like American Haitian. I don't. Anyways, y'all catch my drift, hopefully. So let this be a lesson and an educational moment. We are never too big to learn. So thanks for joining me. As always, be validated.